Hey everybody, welcome into the back room. I'm Andy Ostroy. Today we have the New York Times' Maggie Haberman. We will chat with Maggie in just a second. But first, thank you for tuning in. We appreciate you listening, and we'd love to hear your comments. So email us at backroomandy@gmail.com and or post on our social media, and we'll read some feedback next time. And if you like the podcast, please follow or subscribe and rate and review, and you'll be notified every time we post a new episode. So let's get to our first big thing, the election. For those of us in the room who love polls, we all love polls, right?
Mm-hmm.
No, in all seriousness, you know my feeling on polls, but polls can't be ignored in either, whatever they show. But interestingly, a new post-verdict poll has Biden pulling ahead of Trump in 3 swing states. In particular, and this is a mainstream research, Qualcomm Lab and Florida Atlantic University poll. It shows Biden taking the lead in Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, and Michigan when Bobby Kennedy Jr. is factored in. So that sort of speaks to the whole question of who is he pulling from? He's pulling from Trump.
Maybe.
Maddie laughs.
I don't know. We don't know.
Maddie's like, contrary to you, Andy, I don't believe polls.
No,
Except when they say what I like.
I think, who knows?
That's right. Who knows? I trust this poll as much as I trust any other poll, which is not a lot. But it is interesting because at some point, polls will either show the same thing, so it's not one poll, it's 5 polls, 10 polls, but it still lands you in the same place. Are they accurate? And we know that in the last several years, polls have been wildly inaccurate. But just for me, in a common sense kind of logical standpoint place, it's just hard for me to think that Bobby Kennedy pulls from Joe Biden. I mean, all he's been doing is bashing the shit out of Anthony Fauci, Dr. Fauci. It's like, what Democrat bashes Fauci, you know?
That is his Achilles heel, his anti-vax craziness.
Yeah.
There are Democrats who really feel strongly about that, by the way.
Yeah, but not in a meaningful enough way that it's going to move the needle as much as the anti-vax, anti-Fauci crazies on the right. That's his audience, you know? Interestingly, it was announced yesterday that the Biden campaign has hired the former chief of staff to Adam Kinzinger, Austin Weatherford, to lead their Republican voter outreach effort. They're going to go after prominent GOP endorsers, surrogates. Obviously, Cheney and Chris Christie are huge targets. But just imagine a world where soon Liz Cheney, Chris Christie, other prominent Republicans campaigning for and endorsing Joe Biden. If that's what the goal of this is, that's going to be huge. You know, like that could be on some level the difference between winning and losing.
Well, it can't hurt.
Not going to hurt, for sure. It won't hurt, but it's hard to imagine it not helping, you know?
I think it could peel a few Republicans away, but I think most of the MAGA diehards clearly are not Cheney fans.
No. And one should know that the expectation in this effort is not to appeal to the Marjorie Taylor Greene crazies. It's to appeal to so-called independents, undecideds. You know, I'm going to talk about that later in the rant, but people who are, for whatever reason, still trying to make up their mind. You know, if they're right-wingers and they're like, I'm struggling with this whole Trump thing, and they come out and they see, Chris Christie, he's got a following, you know.
Mm-hmm.
He's a pretty straight shooter for the most part. He's middle of the road. He's not going to do anything crazy. And I think that's the people we need to have, the ones who don't want crazy.
Well, I'd be interested to see, because those are people who have already come out against Trump so strongly, whether they actually make a difference with people who are either undecided or the old kind of Republicans. I'm not saying this sarcastically. I really am curious.
Sure. It's also about the messaging. Think of the messaging that a guy like Chris Christie would say as a former prosecutor. Do you really want to go out and vote for someone who's a convicted felon? Like, it depends on the messaging.
It's a good point, actually. Yeah.
Trump, next big thing. Emphasis on the word big. A lot of news coming out of the courts this week. Maddie's already like busting. He can't wait.
No.
You know, I give you credit when you're right. You're right. When you look at what's happened this week in Florida and Georgia, in terms of the delays, for example, in Florida, Judge Aileen Cannon, she's like,
is she a judge?
Oh,
I guess so.
I
mean, technically.
Define judge. What do you mean by judge? I mean, somebody who's supposed to like be objective, impartial.
Oh, well, then we know she fails that grade.
She basically came out and said, hey, anybody with a hearing request, line forms to the right. I'm going to listen to anybody about anything. And so it's virtually impossible that this trial even starts. I was thinking, okay, it won't be finished, but maybe it'll start before the election. But no way.
Not only the amount of hearings, but what the topic of the hearings are off the charts crazy.
Yeah. Well, it's like, I want a hearing. The prosecution should not be allowed to wear a blue suit and a red tie because that's Trump's outfits. Okay. The red tie hearing will be scheduled for... That's literally what she's doing.
Yeah. But I mean, the idea that whether Jack Smith was appointed illegally is going to actually be heard.
Yeah. And then we have the Georgia situation. So Scott McAfee, the judge there, was like, okay, we can consider all these motions or whatever, but I'm going to let the case proceed. Now, Georgia Court of Appeals steps in and says, nope, nothing happens until all of this stuff, the motion to remove Fani Willis, which I thought was resolved when Judge McAfee said, get rid of what's his name, the lover, and you're good.
It's Georgia.
It's a rainy night in Georgia. So now there's craziness in Georgia, and I can't help thinking, thank fucking God for Alvin Bragg in the year.
Mm-hmm.
Thank God. That man is a convicted felon now because of my city, New York. The town's so nice they named it twice. When I think back on all the talk about this trial, it's not important. Why is it's the least important trial? Why are we doing this one first? Blah, blah, blah. Now look at us, right? Thank God for New York and Alvin Bragg. Because God knows when and if ever Donald Trump is going to be a convicted felon in any of these other cases.
If ever is a good question.
It's a great point. And, there are so many prominent Democrats who are encouraging the Biden campaign to just say it in every single breath, every single sentence. Elizabeth Warren, Beto O'Rourke, because a lot of people don't consume news the way the three of us do. And the more that it gets out there and it's just part of the ethos, convicted killer. Sorry.
Wow. Excuse me. Hang on, Jen. I happen to have Mr. Sigmund Freud right here. Hold on a second. Jen,
How did my mind go there?
I just want to say that was the most incredible Freudian slip I've ever heard in my life. Convicted killer. Nicely done.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Freud. Come back anytime. I've said this before. I'm going to say it again. I want that fucker prosecuted if he spits on the sidewalk, if he jaywalks.
But they're going to take his gun.
But it's like, how
that's a good thing.
How did a Democrat, with everything we know about Donald Trump the last 9 years, right, and how he has destroyed this country, how could any Democrat be arguing against prosecuting him for anything?
Maybe. Unless he wins, and then it's over.
Yeah. The question is, does any of this matter if he wins or if he loses? It doesn't matter if he loses, because eventually the long arm of the law will catch up with him, and he's going to be tried. If he's victorious in November, some of it may go away. He can't make a state case go away. So some of it, Jack Smith's stuff, would certainly be at risk.
At risk? Come on.
You know me. I never say anything is absolute.
Besides, Aileen Cannon will be appointed to the appellate division as soon as he becomes president, so she won't be on the case anymore.
Good point. Well, that's what she's shooting for. But it's interesting. I've heard a lot of different people talk about her and people I respect in the legal profession, that they're not convinced that she's in the tank for him. They're just convinced she's incredibly incompetent and inexperienced. And that's what is behind all of this. But
give me a break.
And that's them. It's not me. I think she's completely in the tank. So I agree with you. Trump's out there violating the gag. I just got a little gagged myself. He's out there violating the gag orders.
No, he never did that. No, not possible.
It's just interesting to me. He's got a sentencing coming up July 11th. And he's doing everything humanly possible, which I think he's doing on purpose, which he always does. He dares the courts. He's daring Judge Marchand to put him in the clink, because these are the things that are factored in, which is like a parole hearing. What danger does this person do to society if we let him back out? Well, what danger does Donald Trump do to society if we don't put him in? That's the question.
It's my understanding that Bragg makes a recommendation as to it. And I'm
Yes.
not even convinced he's going to recommend jail.
Well, he has to recommend jail because you can't try a case like this and say how significant this was and then say, but let him roam free.
Well, he had an opportunity to recommend jail for the $1,000 fines that they were giving, but he specifically said, I'm not going to recommend jail.
Yeah, if I was a gambling man, my money's on him asking for prison time. And it doesn't mean he's going to ask for the judge to throw the book at Trump, but I think there is some measure of deterrent that has to be applied here. Otherwise, you're saying, you know what, it's all a facade. Do whatever you want. We'll go take you to trial. And in the end, I'll say, let him just sit at home. So there will be some recommendation, I think, that's made. All right, let's get to our winners and losers.
My loser, apathy. Let's believe Trump's words when he says he has every right to seek prosecutions of political foes. My winner, Steve Bannon, ordered to report to prison July 1st with an honorable mention to male birth control gel, which shows promise in early state clinical trials.
I just got to point out that I think it's genius of you to mention Steve Bannon, prison, and gel in the same sentence, because that, I think, is going to be his future. Anyway.
I just think that DeSantis, since he hasn't been a loser for a while, is going to be our loser because nothing says freedom like the government telling you what color lights you can use. He has mandated that all of the bridges in Florida cannot use anything but red, white, and blue during Pride Month, so they can't have the colors of the rainbow.
That's so gay.
Exactly. My winner is Bidenomics, because today we heard that the jobs expanded 272,000 this month, which is far more than people expected.
Mm-hmm. My winner, President Biden, who in Normandy this week for the D-Day remembrance continues to demonstrate to voters how a real president acts. My loser, the Georgia Appeals Court and Florida Judge Aileen Cannon, who appear hell-bent on pushing Trump's trials out as far as possible. Which brings us to the weekly rant. I don't understand how anyone at this time can still say they're undecided. Seriously, they haven't figured it out yet? You know what? I'm not buying it. I don't think there's such a thing as undecideds. I believe these people just love the attention, and they love presenting themselves as smarter than the rest of us, that they pretend the process is so complicated. And because they're so much smarter than us, they're spending more time than we are weighing all the information before they ultimately commit to a candidate. And to that, I say a big, fat bullshit. I refuse to believe that after having witnessed the January 6th insurrection, Donald Trump's 2 impeachments, his 4 indictments, his adjudication as a rapist and fraud, and now becoming a convicted felon, there's anyone at this point who goes, still not sure whether to vote for Trump or Biden. They're so similar. What the hell are these so-called undecideds waiting for? A murder? Are they waiting for that sociopath to actually shoot someone on Fifth Avenue before they go, the insurrection, the impeachments, the indictments, the rape, the fraud, the New York guilty verdict, the lying, the bullying, the cruelty, the racism, the treason? None of that moved me to Biden. But this murder thing, wow, that puts it over the edge for me. Sorry. If you still claim to be undecided after every disgusting, despicable, dangerous thing you know about Trump, you're really not. You know exactly who you're voting for. And you always have. All right, let's get to Maggie Haberman. She is a journalist who joined the New York Times in 2015 and was part of a team that won a Pulitzer Prize in 2018 for reporting on the investigations into Donald Trump's and his advisors' connections to Russia. She has twice been a member of a team that was a finalist for a Pulitzer Prize, in 2021 for reporting on the Trump administration's response to the coronavirus, and in 2022 for coverage related to the January 6, 2021 riot at the Capitol. Before joining the New York Times as a campaign correspondent, she worked as a political reporter at Politico from 2010 to 2015. She previously worked at the New York Post and the New York Daily News. Maggie, welcome into the back room.
Thank you for having me.
I've been wanting to have you on the podcast for a while, so I'm really honored to have you here.
I appreciate it.
I want to start off with your New York Times piece, which you co-wrote with Jonathan Swan and Charlie Savage, the title of which is The GOP Push for Post-Verdict Payback, Fight Fire with Fire. Trump's been threatening all sorts of revenge against his perceived enemies since the beginning of time. But what is it about this current climate right now, these particular threats, that makes it way more concerning this time?
Yeah, it's a good question to your point about from the beginning of time, because if you look back, remember he ran, I mean, you know this, but he ran, saying lock her up about Hillary Clinton in 2016, which was not due process focused. He started asking about prosecuting her and other political opponents not long after he took office. He wanted investigations opened into people like John Kerry and so forth. Generally, there were people who stopped him. In terms of what we're seeing now, it's just a broader call across the spectrum of the Republican Party, right? Normally, you hear it from Steve Bannon, but you don't also then hear it from Marco Rubio,
right,
who's a senator and a possible VP pick. John Yoo, who is, in the public mind, most closely associated with the memos related to torture during the Bush administration, is openly advocating a national review for, yes, let's just, let's use our laws to indict Democrats and get back at Democrats. That's what makes this different. And Trump had, after his CPAC speech in March of 2023, which was a couple of weeks before he was indicted the first time, had that line, "I am your retribution," and started talking more openly about payback. His advisors had been trying to scale that back because that talk is off-putting to swing voters and does not help in an electoral context. Trump is not walking it back right now. In fact, in an interview with Sean Hannity the other night, Hannity was all but begging him to say, no, I will not use the tools of government to go after my political rivals, and Trump just wouldn't do it. So I think that you are seeing the absence of a fig leaf, for lack of a better way of putting it, which we've often seen in the past.
So the rhetoric is amped up. The media ecosystem is behind him in a bigger way. He's using the wheels of and the people influential in Congress the way we haven't seen before. So in other words, his sphere of influence is firmly getting behind him, which is way more dangerous, right? Because the guardrails that you mentioned are all down. But at the same time, is that really so much worse for him politically? When you mention independents and critical swing state people, it seems so counterproductive, counterintuitive to be out there saying right now, I'm going to indict and prosecute and imprison J6 committee members. How is that going to appeal to the people that didn't vote for him last time?
Well, it's hard to see how it will. And it's why, he is doing something that a lot of his advisors wish that he would not, which is say things like, we should indict J6 House committee members because Steve Bannon is now facing prison. None of this is the kind of talk that generally appeals to swing voters. I think the question, Andy, is I don't know where we're going to be in 5 months, and I don't know what voters are going to be making their choices on. Will there be some voters who are going to pause and say that they can't vote for somebody who's been convicted of a felony? Are there going to be voters who are going to pause and say they don't like this retributive language? Or are voters going to be making decisions based on more immediate personal concerns? But the retributive language is off-putting to voters when you combine it with an escalation in threats of political violence that we've just seen across the country. That's where I think it becomes very problematic for him. So no, I mean, the short answer is I don't see how it helps him win people over. But I don't know where we're going to be in 5 months.
There was such an astonishing contrast on display this week. On the one hand, you had President Biden in France at Normandy, right, for a D-Day remembrance ceremony. And that, of course, was all about America joining with its allies to fight tyranny and fascism and stop Hitler from marching across Europe. At the same time, you see this fascistic behavior in this country from Trump. From a timing perspective, it's hard to fathom not only that that's just not insane in terms of the Trump campaign if he wants to win again, but just how that won't impact even just the 2, 3, 4% of the voters that we need, that Joe Biden needs to move the needle in a close election.
So one thing that I will say, it's funny, as you were talking, I was thinking about a bit in that book that I did about Trump, Competence Man, where John Kelly, who was the former lieutenant general who served as one of Trump's chiefs of staff, and how he had, by the time he left Trump's employ or direct reporting, had come to see him as a fascist, uniquely incapable of overseeing an American democracy. And then I think back a lot to something that President Obama said in his Democratic National Convention speech in 2016, which was, and I'm paraphrasing since I don't have a quote in front of me, but it was something to the effect of, Americans, Trump's going to lose because we're not a fragile people. Something to the effect of, we don't look to be ruled. I actually think that it has turned out in this country that there are a number of people who find autocratic behavior appealing. And I think that we have seen that over the last 6 years. Whether that is going to be a majority that will elect Trump, or who at least don't mind autocratic behavior and praising autocrats, we're going to find out. But there's a lot of people who have either been okay with or supportive of behaviors that in past elections have not been tolerated here. We are not immune to global trends that are happening across democracies, as it turns out. And what that ends up meaning this fall, I don't know. But you are putting your finger on a central question in terms of what voters have an appetite for.
Mm-hmm. Do you have a theory as to why a certain segment of our population is excited by the idea of autocracy?
I think that a couple of things. I think that people, it becomes easier when someone else is making choices for your life in some cases. And I think that, somebody promising to fix things quickly is appealing to a lot of people. I think one thing that I think that, and my colleagues and I have talked about this a lot, that is underappreciated. It's getting more coverage now, but it is underappreciated about the last couple of years, is just the massive impact that the pandemic had on people. And there is so much anger out there. There's so much voter anger out there. People experienced massive losses. They experienced lost loved ones, job losses. The economy, in their experience of it, because of inflation, didn't go back to what it was. And the last time a lot of people remember feeling good about their lives, I'm not saying about the leadership of the US, but just about their lives, was 2019. And that was before the pandemic. And a lot of people have memory hold a lot of what 2020 was like. And I think that, what we have heard from the Biden team is that they are going to try to point voters to that and get them to see it. I don't know that voters are going to reflect on that time and factor it into their decision making now. I think that's the big question. But I think the degree to which post-COVID attitudes and emotions are factoring into people's desire or interest in or openness to autocratic behaviors is a big factor.
The issue of the economy is so complicated right now, because conventional wisdom is that when there's a good economy, which there is right now, this is probably the greatest economy in decades by any measure of standard metrics that we use and have used for decades, that people say that they're doing well. Not everybody does well in an economy. There's always going to be the lower rungs of people who are struggling for lots of reasons. Housing is an issue. Healthcare is an issue. Inflation is still an issue, although it's way under control. But how do you square the polling, if you believe polling, that's been out recently that says people say my state's economy is good, my own economy is actually okay, but the country's not doing well? That's like A plus B equals X.
I think it's some of the emotional logic that I was talking about before. I think that's a factor. I do think, I think that and there's been a lot of people who have talked about this across the political spectrum, including Democrats, that there are Democrats who are supporting President Biden who would like to see him articulate a message around the economy that takes into account people who still feel like they're paying prices that are too high, that is sort of more of a Bill Clinton-esque message of the 1990s about feeling pain. I also think, and this is purely my theory, I think the fact that there is no unified news environment anymore, and there are so many disparate news sources where people can kind of choose their own adventure on news, lets people go find news that's going to match their emotions. And that allows you to say things that are at odds.
Well, that's really interesting, because you mentioned before about toxicity and the tribalism and the way we're so polarized. I'm not a simple person. I try to dissect things and really get into the issues because I think life is gray, not black and white. But I can't help escaping thinking like everywhere we are today with this toxicity and partisan tribalism and all that is all based on a lie. It's all bullshit, right? Like if we just didn't have Trump in this country right now, because we've always had partisanship. We've always had, Newt Gingrich out there decades ago, and there's always going to be that. But America wasn't as polarized. And it's polarized because we have one individual, in my opinion, who's driven a wedge right down the middle of this country, but with bullshit.
Well, I don't agree with you that everything would be okay if not for Donald Trump. In terms of
not
partisanship.
okay. I want to I want to clarify that. But different, very different.
I think that there would be things that would be different, but I also think that, and I've done a lot of work on this and a lot of research on this, I think that Donald Trump was riding a post-Tea Party wave and a post-2014 immigration focus in congressional races wave. And because of his celebrity and other factors and his anti-interventionist, anti-trade demagoguery, I think that he was able to galvanize people in a way that I don't think anyone else could have. And he has now converted the Republican Party into something fundamentally different than it's ever been. But I think all of these conditions, or many of them, predated him, including, I was having this conversation with someone the other day. The Republican Party's field of grievances, some of it goes back to unfinished, unprocessed, whatever, from when George W. Bush was president. And a lot of Republicans who didn't like certain aspects of his policies liked, his where he was from and the fact that he, spoke about religion in a way that made sense to them. But they were very unhappy with the spending, and they were unhappy with the wars, and they were unhappy with the fiscal collapse. And then we go right into the Tea Party and the Mitt Romney era where, there was a ton of Republican anti-media grievance that was really stewing in a way that was pronounced. And it's a mashup of those factors along with, very Trump-specific stuff. And so you get all of that, including a Republican presidential nominee or presumptive nominee who sees hate as a good thing. And I talked about this in the book that I wrote, but if you go back to the attacks that he led on the Central Park Five, or a group of teenagers who were falsely accused of beating and raping the Central Park jogger, and whose executions he called for before they had even been prosecuted. When the mayor at the time, Ed Koch, was telling people to please don't have hate in your hearts for these folks, Trump said, I want people to hate them. I want society to hate them. And, hate as a civic good is one of, I think, his ethoses. So you combine all of that, and I think that's why we are where we are.
Yeah.
So I'm not totally disagreeing with you that Trump has hypercharged this environment. There's no question about that. And we're talking about somebody who has glorified violence for years. But I think the country has been fraying in various ways for some time.
Yeah, I think the word hypercharge is exactly what I was saying before, in that what we have not experienced pre-Trump was the level of dismantling of our belief and our trust in the judicial system, in the media, in our elections. I mean, these are major things that he has
certainly in the elections. Certainly in the elections. So there's no question about that.
Right. So he has, if you're a person who's in the heartland and you're a Republican and you may be struggling financially or whatever, it seems like it's no longer just about the economy or whatever. It's that you have stopped believing in the very instruments of democracy that you banked on and relied on for years that were untouchable. So that's why I say, like, if we were back to, quote unquote, the good old days of Newt Gingrich, it still would feel like it would be very different, because those guys back then, and even pre-Trump, didn't go after those institutions the same way that he and his cabal have. And I think that's a big part of why we're where we're at today.
I think the attack on institutions is the massive shift. A lot of the attacks on the media started, and the erosion in trust in the media has been going on for some time. As you know, the Iraq War was obviously a big component of it. The post-fiscal collapse period, a big piece of lack of faith in institutions, because a lot of people lost their houses and their livelihoods and their savings, and for the most part, bankers were not punished.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the degree of anger around that can't be understated. Your point about the elections, that is where there is a massive, massive, massive change. You know, when you have somebody, and yes, I am well aware that there are plenty of people who have said an election was stolen before, or, you know, they didn't really win this election. When you refuse to concede, when you say I actually won, when you say there was widespread fraud, even though one court after another has said that is not true, that fundamentally gets to the heart of democracy. That is just something that we had not seen before now. And what we have seen with Trump as well is one of his approaches is repetition. And he will repeat something that isn't true over and over and over again until people start repeating it along with him. And that is especially true around his lies about the election.
Yeah. Getting back to the J6 committee members and his threat to indict them, you know, you cite in your piece, I think it was Laura Loomer who said, not just jail, they should get the death penalty.
Well, what's important to remember too is that somebody like Laura Loomer, you know, she doesn't work for the campaign proper, but she has Trump's ear. She's flown on his plane. You know, she defends him frequently. She talks to him. So, you know, it is one of the things Trump does is he doesn't tell people to stop, and he doesn't necessarily embrace what they do, but he just lets something out there to live. And he's sort of doing that here, where he's saying, oh, yes, you know, quote unquote, weaponization has to stop. But, you know, I'd be within my rights to get revenge. And that's how you start down the slope.
So I want to ask you about the New York trial in a second, but I want to ask you first about Georgia and Florida, because we've had some news in the last couple of days. I mean, I keep telling myself, to keep my own sanity, that these trials will happen one day. But it sure as hell looks really difficult to get there, given what's happening. And I'm not so convinced anymore, you know?
If he is elected, there will not be federal cases against him. I mean, that is a certainty. He will tell the DOJ to drop the charges. Now, a judge could, in either case, could resist that. I don't think Eileen Cannon in Florida would resist it. And we're going to have a much better sense of what's happening with that trial with some hearings that are coming up. Georgia is just ground to a total halt, and it's mired in, you know, attacks on the prosecutor, Phony Willis. The J6 trial, the federal one, I don't think that there's going to be I think there's a less than 5% chance that it's before Election Day. I do think you could end up in a situation where there's an evidentiary hearing that almost becomes a mini trial. But we're not going to be clear if that happens for a couple of weeks after the Supreme Court rules on two fronts. One is on immunity, and one is on one of the charges in the indictment, the 1512 charge is the statute. So, no, I mean, I think that the Manhattan case, you know, barring something massively unforeseen, is going to be it. If Donald Trump loses the election, then that's a different story. You know, I still think that the judge in Florida could end up dismissing the charges. But, you know, this is the case. Do I think that Alvin Bragg, the Manhattan district attorney, thought that this was going to be the one and only case that Trump was going to face? No, I do not. But I think once it became clear that it was likely, he pressed ahead.
It's really interesting because back in the early days, 6, 7, 8, 9 months ago, when there were so many Trump trial balls up in the air, and, you know, especially people on the left were like, it's not even a big deal. Why are they even bringing it? And now we sit back in June. It's like, thankfully, Alvin Bragg in New York were able to bring him to justice in at least this jurisdiction, because God knows when the others are going to get to it. I want to ask you about Aileen Cannon, Judge Cannon. A lot of people say she's in the tank for Trump. But then there are others who say she's grossly incompetent, grossly inexperienced, but she's not in the tank for Trump. Do you have any thoughts on that?
I can't say whether I think she's in the tank or not in the tank, but I think she's making decisions that have been objectively beneficial to him, whatever the reason is. That is clear. This case, you know, she has been moving at a snail's pace on a lot of rulings. It is taking a very, very long time. It has ground this trial to a halt. And she has indulged a lot of the defense's arguments that I think other lawyers would not have. She, as you know, she got slapped back by the 11th Circuit early on for one of her decisions. And I think some of that may have made her more cautious. She's very inexperienced. I've been in her courtroom for the hearings in this case. She presents, whether she is or not, she presents as nervous. And I don't know if she's nervous because Trump is there or if she's just nervous about the case. I don't know. But she comes off as nervous. And so and she fights with the prosecutor's team in pretty rough ways. She's had a couple of flare-ups with the defense lawyers, but nothing like with the prosecutors. And so, she presents as very suspicious of the government's case.
And so with regard to the New York case, you were at the trial a lot, or every day.
Every day.
Every day. And so you had to suffer through that cold, frigid courtroom, right?
It was frigid and cold that first week. That was true. There were days that it was scorching in there. And so, it was not frigid the entire time. And frankly, the cold was bracing enough to keep us all alert, but it was, or at least the reporters. It was a very, very long, rough trial. It was, trials are intense and they're hard. I've covered courts before, and they're often very boring, and it's hard to just sit there. This was not a boring trial, but it was bizarre at every level.
So we see how, and you know him well. You've been reporting on him, following him. You've interviewed him. You know him probably better than most people in the media. We see him violating the gag order again, which is, I don't know, number 11. He's not showing any remorse. He's out there saying, let's lock up Congress. Right. Is there real, tangible connective tissue between that behavior and what he's going to find on July 11th when he's sentenced?
It's an excellent question. It is the $64 million question. And I think the answer is it depends. I think if he continues behaving this way in public all the time, I think it is going to be very hard for Justice Merchan, who the defense did not like him. They believed that he was biased against them. I can't think of another judge in that courthouse who could have handled that case better. Because time after time, he really was bending over backwards to not get into like a test of wills with Trump. And Trump was trying at some points. I think it is going to be very hard for Merchan to not give him some kind of a sentence beyond probation. But what I don't know is there some kind of deferring mechanism where he could put it off so that it doesn't start until after the election or something like that. That I could see. Merchan had a line during one of the gag order violation hearings, and there were two, where he said, Mr. Trump, you are, I think this was the second one, and this is after he had already been fined $10,000 and for 10 violations. And he said, the last thing that I want to do is put you in jail. I'm paraphrasing, but it was the last thing I want to do is put you in jail. You're a former president and possibly a future one. But then he added that clearly the financial penalties weren't stopping him. I take Merchan at his word that he doesn't want to put Trump in jail. I think that's true. But I also think that he's not going to allow behavior that no other convicted felon would get away with before sentencing.
Mm-hmm. What do you think about this sentencing pending appeal thing, where there's this nightmare scenario where he's afforded the opportunity to stay out of jail and not be sentenced to prison until the appeals are done, but then he wins in November, and then if he wins, well, can you put a sitting president in prison? And under that scenario, it just seems like, A, he's not only going to get away with it, but B, God knows what's going to happen to this country.
Look, yeah, if he wins and his sentence has been deferred, if he gets a jail sentence and it's then deferred after the election, no, I don't see any chance that there is an effort to try to put him in prison. I think it would contradict all kinds of OLC, Office of Legal Counsel in the Justice Department guidance about a sitting president. I mean, it just would create a complicated, strange, hard to process scenario that I don't think Alvin Bragg, the prosecutor, would try to push. I don't think the judge would try to push. But we are in such uncharted territory right now that I can't even begin to think how this starts to play out.
Speaker Mike Johnson came out and said that the Supreme Court should step in. Now, obviously, there's no teeth to that legally, but the bigger question is, or the observation is, my God, what does that say about where we are at today, where the Speaker of the United States House of Representatives doesn't like a verdict that was handed up by a jury of one's peers, and for pure partisan political reasons is asking the Supreme Court, which is stacked with Trump appointees, to somehow overturn this verdict or do something else. Isn't that terrifying, given what we've been talking about?
I think that there is a chance that the Supreme Court could intervene here, but I don't think that they're going to intervene before this is played out at the New York Court of Appeals, which is where it's going to go.
How would they intervene? Like, on what basis would that intervention
on what
be?
If there is an intervention, as I understand it, and I am so not a lawyer, because there is a federal election campaign finance violation component to there's this sort of nesting doll legal theory.
It's a jurisdictional issue.
Yes, then they could, in theory, take it up. Now, again, whether that's right or not,
and if are smarter than I am could play this nightmare scenario out. Once the Supreme Court says something, like,
that's it. If they weigh in, that's the end of it. Now, the Supreme Court has been reluctant to weigh in on certain things, but they have weighed in on others. You know, they seem likely to give him some narrow victory on the immunity issue in the J6 case. And I don't know if that's going to be the case. There is a real chance that they will say that this use of 1512, the statute in these J6 prosecutions, which are used for Trump and a lot of people who are charged with breaking into the Capitol, they may toss that. Now, that wouldn't undo all of these convictions because a lot of people are convicted on other charges, but we're getting into a very complicated area. And it's also after, to your point about institutions and Trump's attacks on institutions, he has spent years criticizing the Supreme Court for not doing what he wants. And then, praising Justice Alito for, quote unquote, staying strong around this controversy over the upside down flag. This is what Trump does. And faith in institutions are what democracies are built on.
Was there, in your opinion, a Perry Mason moment in this New York trial?
Clearly not, because there was a guilty verdict. So, I think that that's what Todd Blanche was going for. Trump's main lawyer. Look, I think it's possible that this case was only going to end one way, just because the testimony and the documentary evidence was really overwhelming, and having sat through every day of it. But we're never going to know, because the Trump team, and really specifically Todd Blanche, did not play a perfect game. They made a lot of mistakes, and we will never know whether those factored in or not. But one thing he clearly thought he had a Perry Mason moment with in the court was when he was cross-examining Michael Cohen, and he raised some texts that Michael Cohen had with Keith Schiller, Trump's bodyguard at the time, in 2016. And it was when Cohen was saying a phone call with Trump was related to Stormy Daniels, and Blanche was trying to suggest it was actually related to some other issue that he had been texting Keith Schiller about. But, Cohen faltered slightly, but not really. And so that was a moment, and there were many like this. The commentary outside the courtroom about what was taking place really did not match what was happening inside the courtroom. And so inside the courtroom, Todd Blanche literally was yelling, "Aha!" And it was like out of A Few Good Men. But it didn't seem to leave a mark with the jurors.
What about what I guess we can call the unintentional Perry Mason moment with regard to Bob Costello at the end of the trial?
Well, to be fair to Blanche, my understanding is that was pretty client-driven, but that was unwise to end the case, not with Cohen as the last thing that the jurors heard from, but from Costello, who there were emails contradicting what he had said in his testimony. And he starts fighting with the judge, and he's making faces, and it was not helpful for the defense. But it was the client's idea.
Were you surprised at how measured Michael Cohen was during his testimony?
I was not, because I think that he was really well prepped for that testimony by his lawyer, Danya Perry, and I'm assuming in sessions with the DA's office. But I think that they got to see him lose his temper on the stand during the civil fraud trial in another courthouse in either late last year or in January. I can't remember exactly when it was. But Alina Habba, one of Trump's lawyers, really got under Cohen's skin, and I think that gave them lessons on how to handle him.
Mm-hmm. What about appeal? In your opinion, are there really viable grounds for appeal here?
Look, I think there are people who wouldn't have thought that the Harvey Weinstein verdict was going to get overturned, and it did. So,
right.
I mean, I'm loath to predict what could be seen as a viable appeals option, but my colleagues have written about this. I don't think there's a ton here. I really don't. I mean, I think there are a couple of things they will press. I think that Todd Blanche was on a podcast a few days ago, and he expressed surprise that the jurors had not spoken. And I have to assume he's had some remorse that the jurors have not spoken, or unhappiness that the jurors have not spoken, because that would add to an appeal if they could. But I don't think there are a ton of appeals issues, but who knows? I mean, it's very hard to predict. I do know that Court of Appeals generally don't like overturning jury verdicts.
Mm-hmm. There's a million questions about the election I can ask you, but there's two things I really want your thoughts on. One is what I think is a major, not just source of conversation, but possible impact on this election, which is Bobby Kennedy Jr. And then the other thing is what happens to the Nikki Haley voters, the 15-20% who still are out there going, Trump's not our guy. Where are they going?
Neither one of these is an easy answer. In terms of RFK Jr., I mean, we still don't know where he's on the ballot. So let's wait and see where he ends up. And he's such an X factor because he draws from either Trump or Biden differently depending on the state. So he could end up really playing a role because this is a close election. It just depends on where he gets on the ballot.
Do you have any instinct, any thought about where he's pulling from more?
No, because it really does depend on where. And his ad in the national polling is because he's going to draw in states like California and New York, which are not states that are going to be electorally significant unless there's something unexpected that we're not seeing in the election right now. So I don't have a strong sense of that, and I'm just loath to predict. In terms of Nikki Haley, it's a great question. I mean, there are a lot of voters who were still turning out in some of these primaries, including some closed primaries like Indiana, voting for Nikki Haley. And so I could see them ultimately coming home to Trump. I could see them staying home. I can't see most of them voting for Biden because people who vote in primaries tend not to be party line crossers. But that doesn't mean that they won't if a real pitch is made to them. But to your general question, this is potentially such a close election, such a close election that every factor will matter. And so even if a part,
so even if a part of them, or even a small part of them, go to Biden, that could move the needle in a pretty impactful way.
Absolutely. I mean, remember, the last two elections have been settled by first 80,000 and then about 40,000 voters in 3 states. And I expect this one could be closer.
What about Veep stakes?
Yeah.
You want to handicap that one?
Sir, no thanks. I think trying to guess what Donald Trump is going to do on a VP choice is a fool's errand. What I keep hearing that I think is true is that he doesn't really like any of his choices.
Well, that's funny you say that.
I don't think he...
I have this.
Why is that?
I have this wild theory, which at first when I say it to people, they go, "You're out of your mind," and then they stop and they be like, "Wow, that's actually so on brand." Donnie Jr.
No. But I appreciate that I heard it here first. I think I also
You
heard
might
it
come
here
back to me in a couple
last.
weeks going, "My God, you're a genius."
If he does that, I absolutely will tip my hat and come back to you.
The more you think, I think like the comedians used to say, on the way home, you're going to think about that joke and you're going to laugh. The more you think
I'm
about
definitely
it,
going to think about that.
the more you think about it. I mean, he had no problem putting Lara Trump as head of RNC. He had no problem making Ivanka and Jared these major advisors in his administration. Why would that? Junior's the only one that actually gives him the loyalty right down to the end in January 2029 when the election has to be certified. He's the only one that he can really count on to do that. But
let's talk again. Let's talk again in 5 weeks, and we'll see.
Okay.
We'll see.
My last question to you, I'm almost going to guarantee that it's probably not been asked of you before. And it's a window into the soul question. And one of the best ways to get a window into one's soul is through music. So I want to know Maggie Haberman's top 5 musical artists of all time.
Love that. That is a great question. It's a really not that interesting list. Bruce Springsteen, Beyonce, Taylor Swift.
Oh, there you go.
And then I have to think who would round out my list. But those are the tops of my playlist. Sia. I'm missing a fifth.
4 guys from Liverpool, maybe.
Beastie Boys.
Oh. Well, you have
New Yorkers,
you have the first 2 letters right. I was going Beatles, but I do love the Beastie.
I know.
I do love the Beastie Boys.
Maggie,
Maggie, this has really been great. I'm glad you finally came on, and I would love to have
Me
you
too.
back at some point sooner than later.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Alrighty, take care. This episode of The Back Room was edited and produced by me, Andy Ostroy. It was co-edited and co-produced by Maddie Rosenberg, and co-produced by Jen Hammoud. Our theme song was composed by Andrew Hollander, and our logo was designed by Cricket Langell. And special thanks to Patricia Wind. Please take a moment to rate and review the podcast, and also follow or subscribe. Until next time, keep your eyes on Washington, Hollywood, and your own backyards, and have a great week.